Hello world, we are here.
Okay, you can see the QA list now.
Yeah, again.
Give it a few minutes to register your viewers. You're making that noise into the microphone now.
Sorry.
Okay.
This is what happens when you give me like 2 things of coffee because they mess up my order.
Yeah.
Yay!
Here, we've got some. Did you just say that twice in a row?
No.
Oh, great. Okay. A weird echo there. So.
This is what happens when you...
Oh, I know why I'm getting it. Hold on. Okay, that was very careless. But still. Okay. Oh, also that's where the other was. Okay. Anyway. Anyway. Well, if you want to grab one and start.
Grab one what? Oh.
Questions. Yeah.
Uh... No, I can't. Only you can select. So you pick one.
But you wanted to start with it. You wanted the how to make fight scenes, battle scenes really intense. Got a question. These are coming out of the inbox from the blog for those who are wondering. Hi, how do I make my battle scenes, fights and battle scenes really intense? I want readers to feel adrenaline and danger wrapped up in the moment. I don't know how to convey this in writing.
Would you add that so people can see it?
I just did.
Okay, I can't see it.
It's it's the one at the top.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so one of the big things about writing fights and battles in order to make them intense is that in large part it's a matter of balancing your tension in your narrative, and you can do that in a lot of different ways. Some of those are pacing, which is sentence length, word choice, the amount of time it takes to move through something. So you start with longer sentences and then you get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. You also can do this narratively with the pressures that exist outside your characters versus what they're experiencing on the field itself. So you have a character who's fighting, who has a certain amount of time they have to wait for help to arrive, and they're trying to hold out, but the odds are stacked against them. And as you convey that to the audience, they start to feel that tension building, which starts to make the sequence more intense as you balance all the different worries that come with what's about to happen or occur in combat itself, and what the effects of that are going to be and what the consequences of that are going to be if they fail. So if I die here, the enemy will go on to destroy the small town. If I die here, I'll never see my family again. If I die here, what's going to happen to everything else? And so that way you start building on more than just death. You have the characters' worries about their death, building that sense of tension that ties the sequence back into the greater narrative arc and ties it into the story, so that the fight itself has meaning toward their character development, toward the story itself, and echoes back as the story moves forward. And that's sort of how you get someone wrapped up in the moment, which is they have to really be invested in what's happening to these characters, what's happening to them on the page, what's happening to them, what will happen to them if they die, what's going to happen to all those things they left unfinished. when you care about characters, that's when your fight scenes really start to come to life. And other additional there, I'm losing my tongue. And the additional support of your writing abilities comes with that, um, which you build through the frame for the scene, and then your abilities within the scene itself, which is to write a sequence that is quick and exciting and punchy, that doesn't drag, that feels like it moves. And that's where the pacing comes in, that's where the sentence length comes in, that's where your word choice becomes very important to convey the tone that you want the audience to be feeling. And as a writer, it's your responsibility to sort of control what happens within your story in that respect, through what you choose to do, what your characters choose to do, and how you choose to present that information to your audience. And ultimately, the question of how do I make it intense, it's about becoming more uh, bringing a lot of different facets for your writing together. So making sure you have what's happening in your narrative, what the cost and consequences are going to be for your characters. It's what happens within the actual sequence itself, making sure that the action moves, that you give your characters a chance to breathe, that you keep the pace going very quickly. If it's in a situation where you need the pace to be going very quickly, that you ensure that you build multiple layers of tension for what's going on with the character, what's happening in the sequence as they fight. I've seen some writers say, well, you can't really build tension in that sequence because that's boring. And I'm like, well, no, because as the fight progresses, you're getting tired, you're getting more tired. It means you're getting open to mistakes. You'll make more mistakes. The longer it goes on, the more pressure a character is under to finish it, because if they don't finish it, they'll be finished. Um, so you, like with anything, you start fresh, and then that last leg of trying to get there becomes very, very intense. So you have the tension for the characters in the sequence. You have the tension for what their goals are and what the greater narrative story is for the surrounding sequence, and the fear that if they die, you won't get to see that. The story, what happens to the story? Does it end? And building that fear that your character really could, and believing in that fear that your character really could as you're writing, leaving yourself open to the possibility that they could die, will get you and get them to actually write better. Um, which might sound really silly, I guess, but this is why I've talked about in the blog recently about the possibility of failure, because possibility of failure is what creates intensity. It is what makes us afraid, because when we're invested in a character, we want to see their story finished. We want to see the completion of it. We want to see them either succeed or triumph, and we worry about what will happen to them. But if the author is writing in their mind that this will happen and that will happen and this will happen and then that will happen, while leaving no possibility for in their own mind and in their character's mind that they could fail, that the story could end here if they screw up, then it becomes sort of you end up with a false dichotomy where the author is telling you, yes, it's bad, It's terrible. They could lose, but there's no actual representation of that in the narrative itself. And that sort of will cut away the tension. Uh, Forcing your characters to um, experience that fear of failure is ultimately very important to adding adrenaline and danger. Uh, that they could fail, and not just that they could die, but that they could fail at their goals, fail at what they want, fail at the story. And those are very important things to what make us a hero is overcoming failure and fear of failure. I think, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. There's also there is an element of managing failure that can really, really build tension in the story, where your characters do actually fail to achieve their goals to some extent, and that can really help with building tension for your scenes, and also the erosion factor. Just as you're running through stories, this is a persistent thing, but as you're running through stories, there's a sort of entire subgenre of you're wearing your character down, and that in turn builds tension. Anyway, just added the one from Ada Verhenge that came through earlier. They're not going to be here until they won't actually be available until the fourth. I figured we could take their question and move on to it. But yeah, that covers tension for the most part. I think. I mean, there's certainly more you can do as you learn, as you experiment, as you keep piling stuff on. But the starting point is
Failure is important, and it's important not to be afraid of it. I mean, as a writer, that your characters aren't bad people, aren't bad at their jobs, aren't somehow diminished by the fact that they could or do fail. And I think that's also very important because we sort of, where media is at currently, is there's this horrible feeling that characters have to be perfect. And this is especially true for female characters, that they have to be perfect in every way, that if they are weak, that they can't succeed, that they won't succeed, that they are no longer strong female characters, that if they fuck up and screw the pooch, that they are somehow letting the whole gender down. And, you know, and that's really important to get over. Your character messing up, screwing up, being not being perfectly, completely prepared for whatever they're going to face, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of building tension. You can't be prepared for everything you're going to face. And it's even more unrealistic to say, well, everyone is going to be 100% prepared 100% of the time. Um, and that's important too. Okay.
yeah, I saw that.
Okay.
I did. Aaron, I hope this is actually more audible for you. I'm sorry, I had the microphone where it's been recently, which is out of the way, and I forgot to adjust it. At any rate, actually, in light of that, let's grab your question next. Then go. You've talked about how spies and assassins are adept at betraying, lying, and backstabbing people. So, how do people hiring them trust them not to betray them? How do they keep their agents in line? Who do they send out to track them down if they do? The short version of this is when you're recruiting your own spies, the term gets a little bit muddy, but when you're recruiting your own spies, you have your spies who actually directly work for you as a government. These are people who aren't doing the actual espionage themselves. They're finding other people to work for you. Um, and what they're doing when you're looking for what drives them, how do you keep them in line? In part, you keep track of what they say and cross-reference it with everybody else who's telling you things. But in part, you're looking for people who are actually loyal to your cause or your government. You're looking for patriots. You're looking for people who have some ideological loyalty to you. And then they go out and they find people that will work for them. So there's a layer of deniability. And those people, those are the assets. Those are the ones who are doing the actual frontline spy work in most cases. They're the ones that are sneaking in buildings. There's the ones that are pretending to be others, pretending to be people they're not. And with them, it varies because sometimes they're loyal to you because you pay them, in which case that's a factor you keep track of. And remember, if you're paying them, is somebody else paying them more? You sometimes have ones that are loyal to you because, again, ideology, just like your actual spies. And your assets who are loyal because of ideology, you have to keep track of them. It's the same deal. You have to look at what they're saying to you versus what you're seeing from other assets, what you're seeing from other agents. And sometimes you blackmail them. Sometimes when you need somebody, you need to flip someone, get them working for you. All you do is you hold a gun to their head, figuratively, sometimes literally, and you put them in a situation where they have to work for you. They don't have a choice.
They still can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me see if I got a. Yeah, the microphone is on. I'm going to try bumping up the intake on this. I'm sorry. This is device testing. Okay.
Okay, so I'll take over
Yeah, please do.
here. So what Stark is saying is, and now I'm echoing. Is that just me?
It's probably not just you. Is this better for audio? We really need to set up a text system so that we can actually see chat while it's going on. That's not an option we have right now. But I just tried boosting the gain on the microphone. It's probably going to result in some static. So sorry about that. You can check, see. Okay, there we go. Now I got a nice clean audio feedback.
Okay, so what Stark is saying is that in order to keep your spies in line, you look for people who share your same ideological bent. They are your believers. They believe in the cause that you're fighting for. They believe in what you're doing. They believe in what they're being asked to do, and they believe in the cause itself, even more so than they believe in you. This isn't built on personal loyalty so much as loyalty to their nation in terms of larger spy work. That's really what you're looking for specifically. And from there, you build out to your assets. And your assets are the people who do the groundwork level spying, the ones that they develop. You cross reference everything that your spies are telling you and everything that your assets are telling you, which is why you have uh, multiple spies. So you have many sources of information that you can allow yourself to cross reference everything that goes on. So because you're looking to flip and find assets in a position that can get you the information that you need. But you're also aware that the other people on the other side will be looking to do the exact same thing to yours. And the same sort of techniques that you'll employ to keep your spies in line and you'll employ to keep your assets in line specifically, such as blackmail, which is the figurative or literal gun to the head, uh, loyalty, the corrosion of loyalty, the destruction of someone's ideological belief in what they're fighting for, are all tactics that can be used by your enemy in the same way that you can. And I think that's one of the things that's most important to recognize is that everything that you come up that your spies will do, you need to keep in mind that the enemy will do the same thing to them. And to be aware that betrayal is not just likely, but that it's a fact of life.
Yep.
And usually, who do they send to track them down? The other spies in the area. You don't just keep one spy in a building, you have more than one, and those often watch each other if they're even aware of the other's existence.
Well, the other part there on who do you send is you send the cops. I think that one's a really simple one. If you've got a spy that's a problem and you need to get rid of them, the shortest answer is you just hand them over to law enforcement, let them run them down, because that's their job. The spy is just, they're being paid to commit criminal acts for you, and when their usefulness is expired, you can simply turn them over and turn them in for breaking the law. And that's it. That's another legitimate option.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, that's one of those really simple sort of, what do you do with them? The other possibilities, you might, in some cases, need to send someone who's been specially trained to deal with them. But usually you're looking for the most deniable, most convenient method to get rid of them. And that's usually just going to be the cops.
Because remember, as Burn Notice tells us, spies are just criminals with a government paycheck.
It's a very true statement, actually.
And if you're actually wanting to write spies, I actually recommend the first 2 seasons of Burn Notice. There's a lot of very helpful information there about how that whole thing works.
Another good source is the Sandbag, or it's not the Sandbaggers, it's just Sandbaggers. It was a British series in the 70s. It's very good. Also very much worth watching. That gets a little bit more into clandestine operations, but it's still a very good show. Any rate, I hope my microphone's actually working now. And I have no way to check other than to see the things on the. Can I move my microphone closer? But any rate, next question we've got is: what are some ways my character could become trained in the skills needed to be an assassin without using some sort of assassin training skill or the military? Move that one up.
Uh, Bad childhood.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that's a good one.
It sounds like I'm joking, but I'm not. It's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. Bad childhoods, abusive childhoods, kids that come from broken homes specifically, learn very early how to lie convincingly. They learn very early not to trust anyone. Um, they learn a lot of the necessary skills that you need in order to become an assassin or become a spy. Uh, and the two sort of have some crossover. So when you're actually looking for someone to turn into assassin, to become a hired killer, to go into that line of work, the people that are most likely to are the ones who already have the basic mindset and mentality prepackaged from early experience, because they're more likely to have a jaded outlook on the world. They're more likely to have developed their skills, and not the skills of killing people, but the skills of how to look at people, search out mistrust. And I'm echoing again. Um,
Oh wait, did this get the audio turned back on? No, it didn't. Okay. I don't know what's causing the echo.
but kids that are come from broken homes are more mistrustful. They're more suspicious. They're less likely to trust someone quickly, and they're on the lookout for. They're already primed to be on the lookout for the behaviors you need when going out into the world and being a killer. So it sounds horrible, but it's also true.
If this is just asking about the very practical end of it, you can get combat training, like hand-to-hand combat training, from any number of sources. There's a number of martial arts schools that will actually still teach practical hand-to-hand. There's schools like Sistema and even a couple of years ago Krav Maga, where you could still get stuff that was either at military grade or close to it, because those martial arts haven't really separated off into a recreational form yet. Um, and for weapons training, at least in the U.S., it's kind of the same way. You can learn how to handle firearms without having come out of the military. And you can learn some basics of tactical training, even from individuals who served, rather than specifically from being in the military yourself. Uh, there's an issue. Michi's probably the better one to talk about, but there's been an issue with gangs where gang members were being sentenced basically to serve in the military as part of their sentence, as their sentencing. And what ended up happening was that didn't actually break the gang. It didn't break them out of the gang. It simply took a gang member and gave them military training, and then sent them back to where they came from once their tour of service was up. And then you had these gang members who've been trained in military tactics and operations who could then turn around and hand that off to other members of their own gang, because that community structure was still there. So you end up with a situation where at this point there are actually a number of ways you could end up with military grade training, and training that's intended for combat in the hands of a private citizen without actually having them go through the entire process of having served. Another major one, and this is the thing you're specifically saying not, but a lot of ex-military have exactly the skill set to go into criminal enterprise, or go into functioning as assassins. If you've got somebody who spent the last 20 years doing wet works all over the world, and they've decided that don't no longer want to work for their country, and they've mustered out either because they're too old or for whatever other reason, they still have that skill set, and they can still turn around and use that skill set to make money. So simply saying, well, they went through the military, no, that actually is a legitimate option there.
A lot of the hired killers used by the mob, the Italian mob specifically, or ex-military.
Yeah, especially in the 50s and 60s, because you had a lot of people who'd served in World War II. I wish I had the statistics in front of me to actually back this stuff up, because it's something I read years ago.
It's also good to know that what caused the assassins used by the mob to get outed was their preference for them. Um, One of the ways that the hitmen were actually found by the police was that they routinely used the same people as opposed to using different people. They hired people who were the hired people, and then they just kept using them. And over time, those kills became the police were able to establish a pattern, and then through the pattern able to find who it was that they were using, and we were started to be able to recognize it. And because the hitmen stayed predominantly in singular areas, they were also found.
Yeah.
It took years, but were able to find them, locate them, and notice their existence. If you have a hitman who's moving across state lines, if you have a hitman who occasionally leaves the country for like 5 years to go work in Europe, they're a lot harder to track down, simply because there's not as much information about them or grounds to find them, to establish those patterns, for local law enforcement to have the information at hand that they need to establish the patterns of what they're doing. So it's always worth looking at the hitmen, what information we have on the hitmen the mob used, and how the police found them, and opened up the chain as a result into the rest of the social structure, the mob hierarchy itself. And of course, when I say mob, I'm talking about different criminal organizations in the 1950s ish.
We had an article up. I'm trying to remember when. I think it was last year, maybe a year before, that was actually talking specifically. It was linking to an article that was specific research done on methodology for assassins. It's actually a really good read. I will try to find that and stick it in because I'm going to put some show notes up this time. I'm trying to keep track of those, but I will put some show notes up for questions that got answered this time out that came out of our inbox from the blog itself. So I'll try to find that and include that in the show notes when it comes up. The short version, though, from what I remember, is it's basically that you've got four basic tiers of assassins. You have amateurs who aren't actually hitmen. They're just here because somebody said, "Hey, we can pay you some money to kill somebody," and in a lot of cases, they don't even follow through, as I recall. You've got ones that end up in the range with the military, or sorry, end up in the range of the ex-military mob hitmen, where they'd stay in an area. And ironically, what happened was, and once the police realized this, it became really easy to track them down because everybody knew they were a hitman, and that's a serious problem. Um, you had, oh wait, no, I'm conflating two, aren't I? There's another one before that, and I can't remember the details. I'm sorry. And then you had ones that were your sort of uh, super assassins jumping continent to continent, where the big comment was these probably don't actually exist. They're not a thing that, if they do exist, they're basically impossible to research because of their design. They're almost impossible to identify and out. But it does create a situation where if you want an assassin who's been doing this for years, it's got to be somebody that nobody really knows or is familiar with. It's got to be somebody that's pulled in from outside. That's actually one of the things where I was talking about the special forces suggestion a bit ago, where you have somebody who's been bouncing all over the world and has the skill set that's necessary to move around without leaving a paper trail that would then connect them to any of killings.
And that's the other thing that you need to remember if you want to write the super assassin who's jumping from continent to continent is that they have to be able to move almost invisibly or convincingly. And when I say invisibly, I mean even just being able to pass themselves off as a tourist. Be able to blend into their environment enough that most people don't think about them when they come in and leave an area, that they don't leave much of a footprint. And that's actually more difficult than it sounds when you think about all the different cultures that requires being able to move through that are vastly different and diverse. Uh, Even just going as far as being able to speak the language, you're talking about someone who'd have to actually be able to speak at least 3 to 4 to 6 different languages, probably.
Yeah.
And they might not be able to pass themselves off as a member of the culture itself, which makes sense, but they have to be able to pass themselves off as a tourist, someone innocuous, someone you don't think about much and you don't remember. Ironically, unironically, looking at George Smiley from the John le Carre books is very helpful because he's not, you don't remember him. That's one of the things about him is he's this small sort of busybody little man that no one really, that's sort of the opposite of James Bond, who no one really pays all that much attention to or notices. And that's very important because if someone remembers you, the more likely they are to be able to give details that allow the cops of any country to actually catch you. Um, the likes of James Bond is very, very unlikely to actually be successful, whereas the George Smileys of the world, that's really it.
Yeah, le Carre, actually, it's interesting. Le Carre, Ian McIntyre, who was the one responsible for writing most of the Sandbaggers episodes, and Ian Fleming were all three of them were ex-British intelligence during World War II. And ignoring Fleming for the moment, both le Carre and McIntyre, McIntyre and McIntosh, I'm sorry, it's one or the other. Both of them came back with this very hard edge on espionage that actually reflects a lot more closely the actual operations in warfare during the war. And what happened with Fleming is it's straight up, power empowerment fantasy, which there's nothing wrong with that in its own right. But when you're looking at writing espionage fiction, and that includes assassins, you kind of need to decide where you want to end up on this spectrum between these 2 points. And James Bond is a very formalistic character. He's not at all a realistic one. So it's something to keep in mind.
Also, Aaron is right. The slang, there's also slang to consider. That's a very good point, Aaron, which changes from place to place, even within a single language from city to city. We often joke about, like, I'm originally from California, and I'm from Northern California, and we have a rivalry with Southern California. And, you know, there are actual very serious linguistic differences between the slang used in Northern California and the slang used in Southern California. And this is true just across the board, from state to state, from city to city. And it's why the advice in this special forces books I have lying around from the SAS handbook, I think, was buy local shoes. And the joke in Spartan, which was smoke local cigarettes.
Yeah.
Because it allows you to fit in better, buying local clothing, buying the local products, and using the local products as opposed to your preferred from whatever country you hail from, makes you less identifiable to those people surrounding you and allows you to blend into your environment better. Because the guy with the, Nike shoes in a country where Nike is not common is going to stand out. Or the American made soles or whatever else that allow people to associate you as not belonging, beyond just stuff like slang. One of the things I really actually loved from the Tarantino movie,
Inglorious Bastards.
Inglorious Bastards, is how Michael Fassbender blows his cover to the German agents as he's trying to pass themselves off as one of them. And he counts to 3 using...
Well, no, it's the hand gesture.
Yeah, it's the hand gesture. When he orders 3 drinks, he uses his index finger, his middle finger, his index finger, his middle finger, and his ring finger.
Yeah.
As opposed to when you're in Germany, you start with the thumb when you count. And that is what blows his cover to the German officers, so that they know he's British, which I thought was very clever.
Yeah. And there's stuff you'll run across like this when you're learning a language, where you'll be taught some of these, like, also idioms, but yeah, hand gestures are one of these things that it's not as universal as you think it is. Body language is not as universal as you probably think it is if you've never gone to another country and learned with another country. And that's, the Tarantino film does a great job of pointing that one out there. There's a lot of smart stuff with him, but
how easy it is to blow it.
Yeah. In a larger sense, there is a very specific terminology set for espionage and for tradecraft. There's some good sources for that kicking around. I think the best thing I've got offhand is, ironically, an RPG called Spycraft. It's got a really good glossary at the end of I think it's the second edition, might be the first edition of it, that just lists all of these different spy terms. I've seen other compiled glossaries that aren't quite as complete, and I'm sure there are better ones out there. It's just the one I've got access to.
I actually like Spycraft because it covers both the concept of running hard-nosed, very realistic spy campaigns, and then also talks about running the James Bond style campaigns and the differences between the two, so that you can sort out for yourself the different tropes uh, between super spy fiction and realistic spy fiction. And if you want, find the median for yourself between the two. Because as much as we talk about realism, you don't actually have to pick. A large part of when you're working with fiction is creating something that is believable and enjoyable that your audience buys into. And however you choose to do that, if you're successful at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter so long as you're telling a good story. You don't have to be 100, hold yourself 100% to realism all the time. It's just important to know what the rules are so you know what you're working with, as opposed to breaking that accidentally. You're breaking it intentionally so that you have take power for yourself over the story that you're telling, and you're less likely to fall down a hole at the end of the day. Um, that's part of why I actually really liked Spycraft, um, for that, because it's harder to find where the two intersect in terms of fiction, and where and the things that don't manage to mesh.
It's also one of these things where that line can be really hard to find, even when you're looking at pieces if you're not familiar. One of the general hallmarks of the more formalistic end of the spectrum, the is the overuse of gadgets. It was actually, it got absolutely out of hand with the super spy genre in the 60s, to the point that Get Smart exists partially as a gag on the entire gadget based spy run. But the thing that's interesting with that is, because of where technology's at right now, and because of how specialized some technology has become, it can be really hard to realize that that's not in play sometimes. The thing I'm specifically thinking of are the early 2000s Bourne films. That what you might not realize when you're watching them is almost all of the technology that's at play in those films is stuff that is available off the shelf. I can't speak for the stuff after the third film. I haven't watched any of the ones without Matt Damon, but with the original trilogy, the irony is the technology they're showing is stuff that actually exists and can be implemented roughly that way. So it's something to keep in mind when you're looking, if you're wanting to do the more realistic end, is that the technology that's out there today allows for stuff that is just nuts.
So it's not so much a matter of choosing or denying yourself choices. It's figuring out where the spread is and where you want to land on the entire picture, I guess. Where your median is, and in the bell curve between crazy out there spy fiction, with the cones for
Okay, yeah.
1960s James Bond,
Yeah.
to really hard nosed John Le Carre, George Smiley, as played by Alec Guinness, where he spends most of the movie sitting around, seemingly doing nothing while all the pieces fall into place before he finally moves.
Well, he's moving the entire time. He's just engineering the situation. It's kind
Yeah,
of, yeah.
that it's fun to actually watch that and to read the book for that, to see one where he's just slowly gathering up the information, putting the pieces together, and then moves.
Specifically for Assassins, two things that come to mind, and they're both Michael Mann films, ironically, are Heat and Collateral. Heat is actually about bank robbers, but Collateral is explicitly about an assassin who's going around cleaning out witnesses. And it's both of those, and especially with the commentary tracks by Michael Mann, provide a lot of information that can be applied to how you build an assassin as a character in a realistic sense, what you're looking for and what you need. And listening carefully to the advice he's giving about why characters are set up the way they are, and even to the point of why they dress the way they do, can actually be very instructive and very useful just from a writing perspective. One thing he does is, in both cases, both characters have beards, they have slightly graying hair, They wear gray suits. They wear with white shirts without ties. And the problem with this description is I'm describing two very different characters, but when you're trying to give a physical description of them, they start to blend together and become unidentifiable from the masses. So characters that are actually their job is to go there and kill someone, that's a serious advantage because suddenly the best description that somebody can give the police is worthless. Um, that's one piece. There's a lot more going on there, and there's some pretty decent explanation for how these kinds of people can mitigate threats. Not necessarily how they will, but how they can. So that's probably worth looking at if you've never seen those films.
Payback is also, with to a lesser extent. Uh, it's earlier than I think Heat and Collateral.
No, it's between the two.
I was trying to do. So you can kind of see the evolution of the kind of character that man is working on in Payback between Heat and Collateral. Yes. No, he's playing with the same ideas.
It's not Michael Mann.
Oh no, sorry.
Payback is the guy who did L.A. Confidential. Payback is really good for
My
looking.
brain is just failing me today.
Payback is a really good one if you're wanting to write a con man, and it's a really good film with Mel Gibson. It's also it's the same director as L.A. Confidential, and I'm blanking on the guy's name, but that's another really good film if you're wanting to look at writing a kind of classic noir. There's reasons to watch those films. Those might actually overlap with you're trying to write an assassin, and these are things that could be useful to see and play around with. But
Oh, I remember why I blend together, because they're using the same gray suit.
yeah,
No slight stubble beard.
yeah,
And they blend, all three of those protagonists blend together in my brain.
yeah, yeah. But it's actually a different director. So
Exactly. But the description makes me think.
yeah. There is a third film with Michael Mann that ties in with Heat and Collateral called Thief. I have a copy over there on the shelf that I still need to watch. Haven't gotten around to. It's much earlier, so.
What's interesting about Collateral, too, is that it's Tom Cruise, and that in order to get ready for the role, Tom Cruise went around LA in a FedEx outfit?
It might have been UPS.
Or UPS as a delivery man.
Yeah.
Delivering packages to people, and no one recognized him.
It's definitely worth looking up if you haven't seen that. There's, I believe there are actually videos. I think the whole thing was actually videotaped by somebody from the production staff kicking around online for this. It's pretty interesting to see somebody, and it's more of an acting thing, but it is pretty interesting to see somebody just completely disappear and how much they can simply become invisible, even when it's somebody whose face by this point had been all over film for 20 years, simply by being somebody you don't expect them to be.
And there's a lot to be said for being in places where, for someone, for expectations, for what people expect, and in denying or defying those expectations, and playing against social prejudices, which is, again, another part of the whole spy, assassin, criminal package, which is being able to play to someone's expectations. And that's the cover, being able to play to the expectations of who they expect you to be, rather than who you are. But being able to establish it enough that when held together by, as people cross-reference, you don't come out as being a liar, or obviously lying. A lot of spy fiction fails because it believes that when you're working with a cover, you're appealing to everyone, when the fact is that you're simply establishing an identity that fits within the surrounding world and will appeal mostly to people's prejudices, of what they expect to see and overlook. Like, when you're writing a fantasy novel, you would be looking at spies being. I really like The Witcher's one with this, where he was a traveling cobbler, where it makes sense because it's a lot of mobility. He could get into army camps very easily simply by fixing their shoes, which is something that every soldier needs, is a good pair of boots. He could, because he was a traveling cobbler, he could move between different armies. It gave him an excuse to be places where you normally wouldn't allow someone like a merchant or to be. And that whole sequence was very helpful, I think, in terms of when you're actually thinking about what kind of job does your character have as a cover. It's one that allows them to gain access to places where they're not supposed to, with and talk to people and talk to lots of people, without seeming like they're out of place. And usually it's someone that you want to see, uh, like your couriers who are delivering you information, or your bureaucrat who is sitting in the corner, or your clerk who's sitting in the corner
Well,
copying down notes.
yeah, another one that comes to mind actually, that's more in the cobbler range, but another one that comes to mind is actually Garrick from Deep Space Nine, where basically his cover is that he's a tailor. So you go there to get your suits tailored, or your clothes or whatever tailored, and he's just there. Of course, he's also a spy in exile, so there's more going on. But as actual covers go, that's not a bad one.
It's an excuse. It's a job that gets you an excuse to talk to lots of people, um, and so that in a way that's very in a way that gets them to trust you. Um, and usually that's someone who's seen as lesser than yourself. Uh, think about all the secrets you give to your hairdresser, or what you just start chatting about with an average stranger. What kinds of strangers would you open yourself up to uh, when you're thinking about jobs for your characters that they could have to be their cover?
For example, your bartender.
Yes, your bartender.
That one you get coming and going because you'll end up with people who are already in a suggestive state of mind, and then most of the time what you're getting is useless. But once in a while, yeah, that's the other one that comes to mind for me offhand. But there's a lot of positions like that where you have people that are around you that are doing their job, and because of cultural expectations, you kind of ignore that they're there. And for a spy, that's just an invitation. It's an open invitation. Those are the positions you want. If you're part of a cleaning crew, nobody's going to question why you're, going through the trash, which has actually happened in the past. In fact, there's a very famous thing with I believe it was the Soviet embassy in West Berlin, where that was the inn. They had somebody going in taking out the trash. Uh, yeah,
Yeah, dirty jobs.
yeah, very.
It's the social engineering is in large part getting someone else to see you as lesser than they are. And this is part of why writing someone like an assassin or a spy, it takes a fair amount of confidence, because your character is not going to be the most important person in the room. They can't be. They can't afford to be. They have to be in a serving context, but not usually actually a servant. Um, where they are in a position where they are of less importance, and they're comfortable with that. They're comfortable with not being in the center of attention. They're not comfortable not being in the spotlight. They're comfortable being overlooked, ignored, and avoided, because that's their strength. Well, not avoided, but people don't particularly like them enough to remember them.
There's a fundamental part that I'm making a little bit of a supposition here, but there's a fundamental part of James Bond that really pisses off a lot of actual intelligence officers, and that's the character is being presented as a hero. The character is the center of attention. He's the center of the action. Everything flows to him. Take that however you want. The problem is that's the exact opposite of what you need to be a good human intelligence officer. To be good at actually getting in there and getting the intelligence from people. For that to work, you really need to be the kind of person that can simply manage to be invisible in a room because it's expected you're there.
Well, and we've gotten so many questions in the past about how do I sneak a gun in my cocktail dress, for the female version of the James Bond, and it's sort of a question of why can't they go in as waitstaff?
Yeah. Because
Is there
again,
some particular reason why they need to dress up in the nice dress to be in the center of the action when they could simply be serving drinks and get close to people that way and be less likely to be noticed and be able to hide the gun on their person, have access to being able to hide the gun at any point in time past the security sweeps, and be in a position that no one is paying attention to. It's a question of which is more important, your character's ego, really, which in James Bond's case really is ego, and their own sense of importance and letting you know that they are important, or their ability to do their job, which is to not be noticed. And in a case of a woman, one of the strengths of being female in society, especially European society, is that people don't notice you. Is that you are written off as inherently not dangerous. This is especially true for the stereotypes surrounding the white female, but in a lot of cases, that's what happens, is that women actually make for very effective assassins because they're able to play, because of their position in society allows them to play a role of being seemingly innocuous while actually murdering people. And it's a question of, can you embrace that and use that and utilize that? And are you comfortable with it when you're writing them?
let's see. We've got one other that's actually been bumped up a lot. This is, well, it's a little bit of an off tone from where we've been up until this point. This one actually got fished out of the inbox from the site, but we might as well take it now since a lot of you voted for it. So I'll bring that one up. And that's, how hard would it be for a character to go from being trained in lethal martial arts like Systema to trying to use a martial art based on subduing opponents?
It depends on how well they took to the training, the first training, and then how well they take to the second one in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So it's individual. If you have a character who didn't take to Systema, I mean, part of what makes someone really good at martial arts is how well their body adapts to the training, how well their mind adapts to the training, how well they adapt to the mentality and the ideology that's behind it. If you have a character who enjoys breaking people or who is very efficient and who adopts the Systema ideology of that very quick death, really, and then if they move to a martial art like, say, Aikido, they probably wouldn't feel very at home there. With where it's overwhelming focus on pacifism and avoidance of injury. If you had a character who didn't like Systema, who was trained in Systema, but who didn't like it, didn't adapt to it, didn't adopt it as part of their way of seeing the world, they'd use a martial art that's like Aikido a lot better, and more likely to fall back on it, actually. In large part, when you're talking about characters and training, it's what did they adopt for their mindset. There's how that interfaces with how their body reacts to the training, but training is entirely up to you for how well that sort of gets into your system and how well you adopt it. If you like it, enjoy it, you see it as necessary, you want to do it, you will be better at it. If you didn't like it, then you can be good at it but your body will also resist it. Your mind will resist it and will resist using it. Uh, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's also worth noting on a technical level, somebody who's taking Systema and then repurposing it specifically for Subdual, that's actually an option. You can.
Yeah.
Systema has a point where you have somebody under your control, you lock them up, and then it kicks over and you break things. The same thing happens with Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, with both of them, where you take your opponent to a certain point and you have control over them, and then you can follow through and break them. So for somebody who started training in a martial art that's very specifically designed to, you know, really mess someone up, there is in some cases the option to hold back. There's a specific point that's designed as a break point for the martial artist that you can take somebody to this position and hold them there. And if it's necessary or if it's expedient, then you can follow through and just tear someone apart. But with a lot of well, I shouldn't say with a lot of martial arts, but at least with the martial arts I've had personal experience with, and also what I've seen from Systema, that's there. There is a moment where you lock someone up, and then you have the option to pursue it. I'm not sure if you're looking at something like Krav Maga as their base. I don't think that's present there as much from what I've seen of it. It tends to go straight through. There's no stop point where you've got someone under your control where you can lock them up and just hold them there. It just follows. And that's just a function of how the techniques are structured.
Most do come with it. Stark is right. Most martial arts do come with a break point, where you build into it, and then you reach the moment where you either hold them or go, and the amount of restraint a character exhibits is going to be based on specifically on the character. And I think one of the things that's worth talking about is, in large part, there's an assumption that because you have the skills or know how to do something that you're obviously going to use it, and a character can choose to self-limit. They can choose not to go there. You can have a character who's trained in Systema who doesn't go to a different martial art, but who also doesn't use it to kill people, who uses it to take them to the point where they disable them, and that's it, even possibly where they don't even break their joints. And they choose to lock and hold. One of the things, though, to consider is that there's always the question of what do you do with them. And I don't mean that as a derogatory that you shouldn't not break them. What I mean is there's the question of what do you do with them in a narrative context. When we're looking at something like knockouts in children's media specifically, because we get questions about knockouts all the time, what the knockout actually serves functionally in a fictional context is death. It's consequence-free death, where you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to say it, the character is gone, they will never appear again. And as far as you know, they're fine, but they're probably actually dead. Which is really funny when you go back and think about all the children's media you watched as a kid and realize that those knockouts are probably them dying or being killed in some other way that's not incredibly obvious. So even if you're saying, well, I just want characters to get knocked out, that's fine as long as you recognize that it is just death. It's, PG death.
Okay, I'm actually going to pop another one up we've got here. Got a question from Rachel Palmer. Are there any fighting techniques that are easier to write than others? I've been finding plain boring fist fights throughout my work, and I'd love some variation.
The most difficult kinds of fighting techniques are going to be stuff like holds, locks, wrist releases, wrist breaks, the sort of techniques that require slightly more technical knowledge on how to use them. This includes stuff like throws, where you need to know more about how the technique functions and how the body works in order to convey the image of it on the page. Um, fist fights are actually fairly easy because all you're doing is, well, punching somebody else. And it's possible you may not need to know all that much about what you're doing because it's just he punched somebody. She punched him, he punched her. Kicks can be a nice middle ground. I notice a lot of authors tend to forget about kicks because, again, if you haven't done martial arts, you tend not to think with your legs. Um, I, being Taekwondo, always think with my legs. Um, when you haven't done martial arts before, and with a lot of authors I've seen that aren't martial artists, they tend to go with the upper body only and forget that the legs exist. Even so far as stuff like trips. Um, or they misjudge distance. So they'll have the character punch somebody and then they'll kick them, except it's a roundhouse kick and they haven't gone far enough. They haven't stumbled back far enough for that kick to actually be able to connect. So one of the things to think about and start to familiarize yourself with is the concept of distance. When you're going into your work. So if you're saying, well, I've been writing fist fights, your characters start when they're fighting each other at a distance from each other where their hand techniques will connect. But once you've connected with the hand, you are now in position to, say, grab the head, to work the body, to go for knees. So you start to instead of just being a fist fight, you start to organically move inward, which is what happens in basic combat, is that you can start with the legs, your front kick, your roundhouse kick, your side kick, where you have that amount of distance. And then when the kick ends, if you connected, you're now in position for the hands. So those would be the punches that you do to somebody else, whether that's the gut punch, punching them in the face, punching them in the shoulder, whatever you choose to do from there. And after you've connected with your punch, you're now in range to grab them. And this has different terminology, but that's basically your holds. That's where you can go into your holds, your locks, your grabs, the grappling range, where you can grab someone by the head and hold them. That's where you're in range actually for something like a knee. So if you have a character that's kneeing somebody else in the groin, for instance, they're actually very close to the other person. And so if they knee them in the groin and they don't stumble backwards, they don't actually have room for the punch. I don't know if that made sense. But it's about fighting is in large part about what you have, the room you have to allow your body to build up the power it needs. And power in physical combat comes from rotation. So the arm actually has to have room to chamber before the strike so that your shoulder goes into it, your hips go into it. The arm has to have room to move. If the arm doesn't have room for the full extension, then the power ultimately is limited. And the same is true with your legs. If the leg doesn't have enough room to achieve full extension into the other person's body, then the power will be halved or even negated entirely. And that's where distance is important. And that can be very difficult if you have no experience with being in physical contact, especially violent contact with somebody else. So in terms of techniques that you're working on, I would actually challenge you to start thinking about the fights that you write organically, which is your characters punch somebody else and now they're close, they're nearly nose to nose. What do they do then? And from there, you open up a whole bunch of options. You can, like I said, you can grab the head by the hair, you can knee them in the groin, you can grab the head, slam the head down, up into the knee, and as the knee rises up, to hit them in the face.
You can't see it, but she's actually demonstrating right now.
I will demonstrate accidentally as I'm thinking about it. There are also other punches that work when you're much closer to the body, such as punches to the gut. A lot of the boxing punches, like the hook or the uppercut, are designed to be in that space, that very, very tight space, when you're really close to someone else's body. So the coming up under the jaw, you can do after you've progressed through, say, the jab or the right cross. And now you're in the space where you're very, very close to them. So you use a punch that is designed to take that, to work with extension that's not a full, because again, the hook comes from the side, it comes around, or the uppercut comes up, or you can drive that into the stomach for a sucker punch. The stomach, the abdomen. So there are techniques that actually start to work in that space where you're very close to the body, or striking the shoulder with the hammer fist. And the hammer fist is you use the bottom half of the hand, not the knuckles, but actually the meat. If you close your fist and hit your hand, that the side of it, and that's what you actually use to strike, say, to strike the shoulder, to debilitate it, so that it stuns it so they can't actually use their arm.
It's actually not what you were asking, but a couple of things that can help with writing fight scenes. First thing is to remember the environment your characters are fighting in. Like, actually keep track of where they are and what's going on around them. And as you're running through your fight scene, just keep track of that, because they're going to be moving through this environment that you set up before. It's not a simple situation where you simply have characters trading damage with each other. They're moving along and they're fighting in this environment that you already created, and you can tweak to support this further. And having that intruding into and affecting the fight can help keep things interesting, keep things moving. The other thing, and this is a piece of advice that actually came from the first martial arts experience I ever had, it was self-defense class, was every fight that starts on your feet will end on the ground. And that's not somebody's going to get knocked down, it's you're both going to end up fighting on the ground. You're going to lose your footing, you're going to lose your balance, you're going to be on the ground scrambling and scuffling there. And this isn't true for people who, well, this isn't completely true when you're dealing with martial artists who've both had a lot of training, but for a lot of people, and even a lot of martial artists, yeah, any fight will eventually degenerate into a scrabble across the ground. It's something that a lot of martial artists are trained to avoid doing, but it will happen. Sooner or later, you're going to get knocked down. And between those two things, it will help to keep it from just being two people punching each other. It'll keep things more varied and more alive.
Yeah, especially if you're what's the point Stark makes about utilizing your scene's environment is actually very good, because you have a thing where if your character punches somebody else, like say you're at a bar, they get punched across the side of the face. You see this sequence a lot in movies. They get punched across the side of the face or punched in the face. They stumble backwards. They grab onto the chair. Their hand is on the bar, and suddenly they see the beer bottle that's right next to them. So they seize the beer bottle, and then they hit the other guy in the face with it.
Or they try to break it on the bar and end up with a handful of broken glass.
Yeah, there's that too. Or they grab a mug of beer and throw it in their face, or they can do any number of things. So it's a question of where stopping and thinking as before you could just go fight. Oh, it's just these two characters. Think about the environment they're in, what they might grab to help them gain an advantage, because throwing alcohol into somebody's eyes actually is a legitimate tactic. The same as hitting them in the head with a beer bottle. depending on, you know, whether or not they're in a state where they want to put glass in the other guy's head. That's a real that those are real tactics uh, that you can use, just like grabbing the bar stool to use that as a means of fending off multiple opponents to force them to keep their distance is also a real thing. So stopping and thinking about the environment that your characters are working in and fighting in, and how you can use that, can be very, very helpful to making your fights more interesting, more dynamic, and more intense, because it grounds you in the sequence and in the scene.
Okay, we've actually got 2 more questions here. Just came through. I'm going to bring up Arad's first. What are some injuries you can get from training with someone? Does training with someone increase the risk of getting hurt? What are the most dangerous styles to train in that you're more likely to get hurt in?
I hate injury questions, because usually if somebody's getting injured, it's a failure on the part of the teachers and them not paying attention, or it was an accident.
It does happen. I mean, I've got the scar on my lip from taking an elbow to the face. So
I broke my leg when I was 12, just
yeah,
on accident. Spiral fracture to the tibia. That was a nearly a year recovery, by the way. That's where I get my wheelchair experience for 2 months. But the point of training, ultimately, for the most part, is safety. And this is actually very, very important. Uh, you can get hurt in a lot of different styles, and it's very easy to, especially when you're working with styles that do stuff like joint manipulation, that are playing with or working with teaching people about how to manipulate pressure points. That can lead to long-term permanent damage. I mean, I broke my leg learning a tornado kick, which is a rotating kick where you kick one roundhouse, then you spin and jump, and you kick with another roundhouse and use the momentum of one to carry you through into the other. And the momentum of that twist was actually what broke my leg, because my body kept turning. My foot, being sweaty, got caught on the floor on the mat, and my body just turned. My foot didn't move, my leg stopped moving, and then snap. That is not an uncommon injury for when working with spin kicks specifically. So what injuries are common? Lots of them.
yeah.
You can end up with broken bones. My brother, in a sparring event with somebody else, fractured his eye socket from getting punched in the face when they were using the UFC, when the UFC was still using fiberglass gloves. You can't find those anymore, by the way. I've looked for them. You cannot find them. They are a hazard. But he actually cracked the bone underneath his eye and nearly lost the use of that eye, simply because our instructors were not paying attention and allowed them to use something they really shouldn't have as for training. My brother was a teenager, by the way.
There's the biggest risk in training, and this isn't specifically with teenagers, but they're certainly prone to it. The biggest risk is going to be that you've got a student that does something they're not supposed to do. They're really not supposed to do. They were probably warned not to do. And if they weren't warned not to do it, that was the instructor seriously failed. But that can be all sorts of things. Again, I took a blow to the face from an elbow that left a scar on my lower lip that was something that should have been caught before it followed through. The
Students are morons.
This is true.
Students are morons. There's a certain level where you're working with training. When you're training somebody, they start to feel a sense of their own invincibility, because when you're doing any sort of physical activity, the endorphins start pumping. And this is especially true with somebody who's younger. The endorphins start pumping. They feel strong. They feel powerful. They feel invincible and untouchable. And in a lot of cases, in the early stages of training, especially when you're looking at white belt through brown belt, usually, even up until black belt, where the early black belt, where they have enough knowledge that they've started to do things, but not enough to realize, but they haven't hit the point yet to realize just how dangerous it actually is. And so you'll have students who get cocky, get cocksure, get arrogant, who push it too far, who do things they shouldn't, and when their instructors aren't paying attention, manage to screw themselves over, sometimes in permanent ways, or their instructor will just be bad. And a lot of cases, if you're seeing lots of injuries, that's the result of the instructor being bad. I know that my martial arts instructor, Jorge, couldn't do full splits because when he went into training, like on his first day in a different school from the one he actually ended up in later, his instructor forced him into full splits all the way down, which tore up the muscles on the inside of his legs. And he could never actually gain height with his kicks later, like above the head sort of height with full flexibility, because his instructor forced his body to do something that it couldn't. And that's an example of a training injury where the teacher was very much at fault. Especially when you're talking about stuff like flexibility, it needs to be built up slowly over time. You can't force it. You sort of have to encourage the muscles into it by pushing yourself slowly, sometimes over years, to gain the necessary flexibility. And in that case, and what his teacher did was actually a common practice for some teachers in the Taekwondo community. And it fucked him up forever. So if you're asking about injuries, I can tell you're looking at either a case where the student pushed it too far, pushed the technique too far because they thought what they were doing was safe and it wasn't. Or they thought they could handle it and they couldn't. Or a situation where the teacher actually pushed their student to the point where they broke. Or in the case of, or it's both, where it's just they weren't paying attention. I think Stark has a story from a different karate instructor, black belt, where they had let 2 brown belts, I think, spar.
Yeah, they let 2 brown belts spar, and the brown belts broke each other's legs.
Yeah. So injuries are actually fairly common across the board in all martial arts, including recreational. And it's very easy for it to happen if you're not paying attention, if you're not trying to catch it. And if you're working used to an environment with a mostly safe school, it is less obvious about how bad it can go if things aren't locked down.
On the third part of that, what are the most dangerous styles to train in that are most likely to get you hurt? Weapons. Training with weapons, yeah.
Weapons training.
Generally speaking, with martial arts, they'll start you with hand to hand, even if there are armed forms associated with that martial art. And then once you've mastered that or reached a certain level of proficiency, then they'll start thinking about letting you play with weapons that are on the low end of dangerous and gradually work your way up. When you're talking about things like the whip sword, I forget the name of it, but the Indian whip sword, you're looking at a weapon that is nearly impossible to use safely.
The three-sectional staff.
Yeah, that's another one. Nunchaku.
Nah, nunchucky aren't quite so bad. The
They
three
are for if you don't know what you're doing.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
The three-sectional staff will clock you in the head. I've had other people that were talking about training that for their weapons form, and they actually had to wear headgear because they kept hitting themselves.
But yeah.
It sounds a lot less funny than it is. Actually, it's not a good idea. But yeah, you get injured a lot. You can be injured a lot when you're training with weapons.
And as a result, it's something that gets gated off and then presented later as you're going up through belt ranks.
And they are more dangerous. I should also say that the person who's clacking themselves in the head with the staff was a second-degree black belt in his 20s. So he knew what he was doing. He just didn't know the weapon, and even basic techniques with that can have nasty side effects if you're not prepared for what's going to happen. The whip chain can actually also be a bad one for similar reasons, though not quite as dangerous.
Oh, the one that just mounts a kami on the end of a chain? Or are you thinking of something else?
The Chinese one.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what that is.
It's basically you mount a small knife on the end of the chain and you spin it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
The whip chain is very popular. And the three-sectional staff are both very popular for martial artists who do competition, who do martial arts tournaments, competition, specifically weapons forms and musical forms, because of how flashy they are. Just like with Taekwondo, why Taekwondo is so common in martial arts stunt work. The whip chain, because it spins, anything that spins really, it is more visually entertaining. So you get a lot of martial artists who probably shouldn't be training on it, working with it, and that can have some nasty side effects. And when I'm saying who shouldn't be training with it, I'm usually talking about martial arts in a different discipline of a substantial level. I mean, when we were doing martial arts with the Uni Reyes organization, when we're talking weapons forms, where we would develop our own to music as part of our test, that was third-degree black belt. So you're pretty, at that point, you'd have been training with the organization for about 7 to 10 years. So these are people who've been doing it for a very long time and still manage to injure themselves. And I laugh about it, but it's not funny.
Okay, I'm going to grab Sophie Bennett's. How can I incorporate guns into fighting, not actually shooting? Like hitting the opponent with a gun or something? The short answer here is you can't really. It's not a safe thing to do. The gun, with firearms, they're designed to shoot someone. If you're actively abusing the weapon by beating someone over the head with it, you're running the risk of the thing going off. And this isn't across the board, like if it's empty or some other circumstance, but in general, you're talking about a kind of weapon handling that is strongly discouraged because it's dangerous. Not to you, not to the person you're fighting, but to anyone else in the general environment. So, no, there isn't really. And there's no real hand-to-hand. I said this the other day. There's no real hand-to-hand form that incorporates firearms as a supplemental tool. There are techniques, especially things like gun disarms, that are designed to flow into into the use of the firearm. There are fast draw techniques that are designed to go straight into a close range gut shot, but generally speaking, it's no, you don't you don't want to do that with a gun. The only exception I can think of, the only other exception I can think of where you're actually using the gun as as a melee weapon are things with fixed bayonets, where you take the gun, you take the rifle, the way it's designed, you're out of ammo, so you put a knife on the end and then poke them with it. But they're not they're not designed in such a way that you can really use them safely as a melee weapon. Most of them won't be able to take the abuse, and it's not what they're supposed to be used for. I'm reminded actually of a comment from a Marine a few years ago, where he joked about the Heckler and Koch USP as being it's a very expensive and very unsafe hammer. You can use it to pull tent poles with it, and not much else. But you don't want to do that kind of thing with a gun. It's just that's not how those are used. Anyway, we've got another question here I do want to grab from Leah Lichtenstein, which is, can I ask multiple questions? Yes, though it is getting a little bit late. And you have a character who is a Naga, and wondering how he would move.
Like a snake.
Yeah, if it's a normal Naga, like humanoid parts from the waist up, snake parts from the waist down, it's going to move like a snake in a sort of undulating pattern. The one thing that comes to mind, and it's name association for me, but the one thing that comes to mind that might be useful to look at is the Naga book from World of Darkness that was Were Snakes. It's spelled a little bit differently.
Yeah. Were snakes are awesome. The other thing I would, if you have questions about something like a Naga, for how it moves, I would actually start looking at snakes, specifically snakes that rear back to strike, like the cobra, and just spend a lot of time watching videos about them on YouTube, so you can sort of get a sense for how they move across the ground. And once you have that, you can start to incorporate the human motions into that. But it's important to get their movement patterns down first. And when you're incorporating snake body parts, it's like a snake.
Now, the other thing that, if you've got access to a herpetologist or anybody who keeps snakes, another thing that's an option is spend some time with a ball python or the small, highly active, and not particularly threatening snakes, and just get a feel for how they move. That might not be something you're comfortable with, but it will help.
And you can always watch the Rikki Tikki Tavi cartoon. I think you can actually find that on YouTube. With paying special attention to Nag and Nagaina and their movements, which is fairly, in cartoon format, fairly accurate to how cobras move. Also, because that movie is fun. It's Jungle Book.
Leah, if you've got more questions, probably want to send them to us via the blog, because we've already run for half an hour longer than we intended. So it has been fantastic with you guys, and hope to see you when we do the next one of these, which will probably be in about 2 weeks. And
yes, we're still getting stuff together for the Patreon for the private conversations. And if any of you are $5 subscribers, we're sorry about that. Last month has been really hectic in terms of life stuff. And it's also a good time to remind everyone that who is watching that we do have our Patreon, and it has subscriber benefits. So if you wanted to check that out and help support us, that would be great.
so, thanks, everybody, and we will see you again as soon as we can.